This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and today is Wednesday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In some episodes of this series, I look at the worst cards in a particular category, and that's what we're doing today with a look at cards that cost 1 mana. You might be thinking, hey, I thought you said in the last top 10 on worst mana values that you had done them all, and you'd be right, I did say that, but it turns out I was wrong. While I have done worst 1-drop creatures, I hadn't actually done 1 mana cards more generally, so I thought I would remedy that today. 1 mana is a small investment, so no one should expect every 1 mana card to do something super impressive, but that doesn't mean 1 mana cards can't be bad. It is worth remembering that your cards themselves are a resource, and if your 1 mana card doesn't do something to make up for that, you're going to be in trouble. Plus, there are many 1 mana cards out there that do more harm than good. While the cards that appear on this list in the order in which they appear is ultimately, left to my opinion, there are some requirements for a card to end up here. It has to be bad in all of Magic's main play formats, that's 60 card constructed, EDH, and limited. Additionally, a card has to have been bad for its entire history. In other words, for a card to appear on one of my worst lists, it has to be bad everywhere and throughout all of Magic's history. In all, there are 2,542 1-mana cards in Magic, and in this video, I'll give my picks for the 10 worst 1-mana cards of all time. At number 10, it is Alabaster Leech. This 1-mana 1/3 comes with a massive downside. It makes all of your white spells cost 1 additional white mana. That really isn't worth what you get, even in a time where a 1-mana 1/3 was far above rate for a creature. If you wanted to try to negate that downside, you had to not play any other white cards, but you really want to cast this 1/3 on turn 1, otherwise the upside becomes increasingly irrelevant, and if you're not playing any other white cards, you probably don't have that many planes, so it's going to be difficult to cast this when you need to. So the tension between trying to negate the downside and wanting to play this early is a very real problem. The one kind of silly thing you can do with a leech is donate it to an opponent who's playing white, and it is a creature, it can attack and block. Those things don't make it worth playing, but it does mean the leech does something for you in some situations, which is more than can be said for pretty much every other card on the list. Anytime I talk about this card, I think it's hilarious to talk about Staunch Shieldmate, a more recent 1-mana 1/3 with no downside at all, and this card wasn't good enough to see play. It really wasn't even worth it in Limited. But yeah, the point is, Alabaster Leech is awful, but I do think there are worse 1-mana cards. At number 9, I have Flailing Soldier. This is another above-rate creature, even by today's standards. After all, it's a 1-mana 2/2, but it has a text box that is mostly downside. Any player can pay 1 generic mana to give it +1/+1 or -1/-1 until end of turn. This means that anytime you play Flailing Soldier, you effectively hand a removal spell to your opponent. If your opponent goes first and you play your Flailing Soldier, they can simply kill it by tapping 2 mana. Sure, that does kind of mean you get some tempo. After all, you pay 1 mana and they pay 2 to kill it, but that isn't enough to make up for the fact that you're giving card advantage to your opponent. It does get better if you go first or if you play it later in the game, but you still find yourself in spots where you have to leave mana up just to save the soldier. It's easy to imagine attacking and buffing the soldier to an absolutely massive size, and it does do that a low percentage of the time. But the fact you always have to have mana up or your opponent can easily kill your creature is a huge problem. At number 8, it is Withering Hex. This 1-mana aura doesn't do anything. Okay, that's not entirely true, but it is true that it doesn't do anything when you first play it, and that's a huge problem. It can eventually do something, since that creature gets a -1/-1 counter every time any player cycles a card. It's tempting to look at this as an efficient removal spell for a cycling deck, but the fact it doesn't do anything at first, and the fact that it takes a long time to actually remove that creature, makes this card terrible. Cycling decks have been a thing in several formats too, but this is still a card no one plays. At number 7, it's Arkham Slay. This 1-mana artifact has an activated ability that costs 2 mana, and it gives a creature vigilance until end of turn. If the card stopped there, it wouldn't be a good card, but it would be nowhere close to making this list. But the Slay has a massive restriction. Your opponent has to control a snowland, or you can't use this ability at all. With that big of a downside, you should really expect something a little more powerful than just getting Vigilance. Basically, this is meant to sort of hose snow decks, but it fails even there because no one ever has and no one ever will side this in against snow decks and feel like they're really going to punish their opponent for their reliance on snowlands. But hey, At least the flavor makes sense here. You can't use a sleigh if there isn't snow. At number 6, I have 3 cards: Glyph of Destruction, Glyph of Life, and Glyph of Reincarnation. I had considered including all 5 of the cards in this cycle, which are all 5 1-mana instants from Legends, all of which give some temporary bonus to a creature with the wall type. Obviously enough, that makes them incredibly narrow, since not only is it only restricted to one card type, but that card type all has Defender, and these glyphs all have effects that do something only when your wall blocks, so in situation where a wall doesn't block, these cards are useless. They are all bad, but I think the other 2 at least do something meaningful enough to avoid showing up on the list. The blue one taps a creature, your wall blocks, and it doesn't untap for X turns, where X is the attacking creature's power, and Glyph of Doom destroys every creature that a wall blocks. Those both actually have an impact on the board when things line up correctly, but the other 3 are some of the worst cards in the game. Even when things line up correctly, they don't really do anything worthwhile. The white one gains you life equal to the amount of damage done to a wall, so you go down a card for what's usually going to be a fairly meaningless effect. Glyph of Destruction gives a wall an impressive +10/+10, meaning it can take down pretty much anything, but it also destroys your wall at the end of your turn, so the best case scenario here is that you 2-for-1 yourself. The green one destroys creatures that a wall blocks, but it also returns a creature card from the attacking player's graveyard to the battlefield. You get to choose the card, but no matter what, your opponent is getting something meaningful back. And remember, these awful cards are entirely useless unless you're blocking on your opponent's turn. Basically, these are really narrow, and they have you go down cards for effects that just aren't worth it. At number 5, it is Juju Bubble. This 1-mana artifact has an activated ability that costs 2 mana, and you get to gain 1 life. If that's all this card has going on, it would actually be pretty impressive. But they tacked on 2 huge downsides that make this card pretty much unplayable. First, it has cumulative upkeep, which means you have to pay a cost each upkeep to keep it in play, and the cost increases every single turn. So you pay 1 mana on that first upkeep, then 2 mana, and so on. That's already a big downside, as it decreases your ability to actually use the bubble to gain life. But you also have to sacrifice the bubble anytime you cast a spell. So the bubble wants you to be all in on using it, and that's a serious problem because it also makes you spend mana just to keep it around. It does have the upside of being a potential outlet for when you generate infinite mana, but there are so many better examples of that out there, you don't even run something like this because it is awful in any situation where you don't have that infinite mana. So yeah, the downsides the card comes with make it one of the worst cards in Magic. At number 4, it is Fasting. This 1-mana enchantment gains a hunger counter every upkeep and gets destroyed once it has 5 or more of them. It also gets destroyed when you draw a card, so like Juju Bubble, its time is restricted to a very narrow window, and it really wants you to go all in on it, but it isn't worth it at all because the effect this gives you is that you skip your draw step and you gain 2 life. Gaining 2 life is basically never worth a card. At the very best, you play Fasting and it doesn't do anything, since you just decide to draw a card, and at the very worst, you decide to let it gain you some life, but go even farther behind on cards. You don't want to be doing either of those things. At number 3, I have the Lace Cycle. These 1-mana instants all allow you to change the color of a spell or a permanent to the same color of that particular lace. That effect is entirely meaningless about 99% of the time, and thus not worth the card you use on the effect. There are some narrow corner cases where you can use this to make some sort of silly things happen, but they take a lot of work, and it just isn't even close to worth that effort. At number 2, I've included 2 cards, Tangard's Glare and Visions. Both of these 1-mana sorceries have a very small effect that involves the top few cards of a library. They both start out by being cards that don't give you a card's worth of value back, and that's not really where you want to be. Visions lets you look at the top 5 cards of any library, and then you can shuffle. That's right, it doesn't even let you reorder the cards or anything. Your only options are that you look at those 5 cards or shuffle it, and neither of those is very good. Tangard's Glare is probably even worse, though, because it lets you and your opponent reorder the top 3 cards of one another's library. This can let you really mess up your opponent's next few turns, but because you allow your opponent to do the same thing, you come out really far behind, since you're the one who goes down a card and spent a mana on the effect. And my pick for the worst 1-mana card in Magic is Cocoon. This 1-mana aura can only enchant one of your creatures, and that's pretty bad, because it starts out feeling like you cast a removal spell on your own creature. This is because Cocoon's initial effect is that it taps your creature and puts 3 pupa counters on it. Then the creature doesn't untap as long as the Cocoon has a counter. You do get to remove a pupa counter every upkeep, and then finally when you can't remove a counter, so in other words 4 turns after you cast it, you sacrifice the Cocoon and put a +1/+1 counter on the enchanted creature, and it gains flying. So the flavor makes sense here. Your creature isn't very useful while it's in a cocoon, and it comes out better, but the issue is the amount of time it takes for that to happen. You effectively remove one of your creatures for 4 turns, and what you get out of it isn't even close to being worth it. Sure, +1/+1 in flying for a 1-mana aura is a good rate, but not when it takes this long and takes one of your creatures completely out of the game. It would probably be a better card if you could only put it on opposing creatures, and that's just hilarious, and what makes this my pick for the worst 1-mana card in Magic. So, those are my picks for the 10 worst 1-mana cards in Magic. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to own any of these cards, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the worst cards in Magic, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And if you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.